Okay, I think this is on. So then I suppose we can get started. Oh, now it's even more on. So hi, thanks for being here. This session will be about the numbers that rule our lives. It's going to be a little bit eclectic. We'll talk about how numbers are being used in governments, but also how numbers are being used in science, where of course many numbers are used. Also how companies are using numbers often to measure the performance of the people who work at those companies. I guess I should probably introduce myself. I'm Stijn de Brouwer. I'm originally from Belgium. I started out doing a little bit of journalism, but sort of very early on figured out that I was better at the numbers than at the writing. And so since then I've been doing mainly analytics at various different companies. First at a local newspaper company in the US. After that I did analytics at The Guardian, at their data science team. Most recently analytics at Fusion, an American TV station and website, and sort of various other things in between. So I guess I'm sort of my background is mainly analytics, which is really not going to be the topic of today. But when you do analytics, when you measure how many page views, for example, something gets, of course you very quickly get into questions of like, well, what does this mean about, like, is one writer, is one journalist better than another, or are they not? And can you really say that if the only thing you know is a page view? Well, probably not, because there are so many other criteria by which to judge the work of a journalist. The quality of the writing, but also did it, resonate with the audience? Did it get anything done in society? And so questions of how we, as a society, how we measure people, because it's really, we're not just measuring things, right? We're not just, like a scientist will often measure the acceleration speed of whatnot, but no, what we're really measuring in a lot of cases is people. And so a lot of questions arise as to the fairness of a lot of those measurements, which is how I started thinking about this topic. Yeah, so the problem is if you look at many of those metrics, and I've already mentioned page views as sort of a really bad metric in many ways of the work that we do. But if you look at if you look at metrics in society as a whole, you notice that there's very, very many bad ones. For example, I think many people would probably agree that using GDP, domestic production as a way to measure our society's sort of progress has been sort of disastrous. It's led to sort of an ecological disaster. So that's certainly not good. If you look at science, a lot of ways it would improve the economy, and the question was, do they actually improve the economy? And so because of that, people started measuring economic output. At that time, this was not really a problem because there was some globalization. Of course, there was international trade, but mostly, stuff was just sold in a sort of a very local radius. So GDP works very well for that. On the other hand, if you look today at how, for example, if you take the iPhone as an example, the iPhone is currently counted as a product that is made in China. And it is made in China, but it is made from components that come from Japan, components that come from Korea. The design, of course, comes from the US. And so if you actually untangle how all those trade streams work, it actually turns out that instead of being a product that contributes to the trade deficit of the US, especially in the US. I don't hear a lot of that here in Europe, but especially in the US, there's often this fear of China overtaking the world, and we have this trade deficit with China, and it's going to destroy our lives and that kind of thing. But if you look at the iPhone as an example, so it's being counted currently in measurements of GDP as 100% a Chinese product, because that's where it's made. if you untangle it, certain researchers did it, it turns out that actually you can count it as 70% or 80% something that contributes to the American economy and something that contributes to the Chinese economy for maybe only 10% of its final sales value. So it kind of shows how metrics that are no longer working kind of stick around. And why do they stick around? Well, because what if you figured out a better metric than GDP? You figured out the perfect metric, and you go to government ministers and you say, like, I figured it out, I've got the metric for you. The problem is then suddenly all of the comparisons that they've been making, like, are we doing better this year than last year? Or are we doing better than this other country? All of those comparisons become void because you're using your own special little metric and everyone else is just using GDP, which is why, you know, bad metrics tend to stick around. But there are examples of how this is not always true. And so, for example, if you look at how poverty is being measured, 30, 40 years ago when people thought about poverty, they thought about, well, do you have enough food to eat? Can you afford a place to stay? And based on that, they decided the poverty level. And they said, you know, if you don't have enough food, then you're poor, essentially. And all sort of measurements of poverty were based around that. More recently, I think sociologists have come to the conclusion that this is a really bad way to measure poverty, because what if you have a house and you have enough to eat and you can send your kids to school, but you don't have a television? Are you then poor or not poor? Well, actually, in terms of the opportunities that you have in society, you're actually very poor in chances because, you know, at work, at the water cooler conversation, you will not be able to participate. If you don't have a smartphone and you don't have all of those messaging apps, you're sort of totally separate from what most people use to organize their social lives. And so that's a very real indicator of poverty. And so sociologists have adopted that functional approach. And it's been annoying. So I have some sociologist friends, and so they say, like, well, we used to have all of these poverty metrics, and now we're using all of these other poverty metrics, and they're not comparable at all. So it's like, how can we compare poverty today to poverty 20 years ago? We actually don't really know. So it's really hard. But the old definitions were so crap, the old metrics are so crap, that they said it's just better to switch to something new. And so sometimes those metrics do change and they do improve. And currently the way poverty is being measured in that very functional way, makes sociologists very happy. And that means that the way research into poverty is done and then how governments can change things and can reduce poverty, it's become just much easier because of those changes. Another interesting example might be university rankings. I'm sorry, it's quite a US-focused example. So in the US, universities are ranked according to the US News ranking, which is just a newspaper ranking, but people take it very seriously. As you might know, if you want to go to university in the US, you have to do SAT tests, so they're sort of like a standardized test that you do before going to college. But some colleges have decided that they don't care for the SATs. You know, SAT is another way in which people are being measured, and some people think it's a very stupid way in which people are being measured. And so some colleges have said, no, we don't do SATs. But the US News ranking is based in part on what your criteria are for the SATs. Like, if you only admit people who have, I don't even know what the scale is, but if you only admit, it's up to 1,400, right? So if you only admit people who have 1,300 or better, then you're a very selective college, and that will put you near the top of the US News list. And so you have these very good liberal arts colleges in the US, and they've said, no, we don't use the SAT anymore. And suddenly, from being at the top of the list, they've disappeared off the list because US News says, well, sorry, if you don't use the SAT, we can't put you on the list anymore. And so in that sense, bad metrics encourage the status quo because the better schools are actually being punished for being innovative and for thinking about how to value the work of their students and how to decide who's a better and a worse student. GDP, we've talked a little bit about that. Poverty, we've talked a little bit about that. PISA, I think I'm going to skip it, but this is actually an interest. Well, let's talk a little bit about PISA. So you're maybe familiar with the math tests that PISA does. So they compare the math performance in It's mainly in high school. I think it's 15 and 16-year-olds. And so they get a lot of flack in newspapers as well for making unfair comparisons. Again, perhaps a little bit US-centric, but a lot of people in the States are very upset at the fact that Finland keeps beating them in the PISA tests. There's some degree of truth to that, because if you look at the demographic composition of Finland and you look at the demographic composition of the US, you see that in the US there's much more immigration, there are many more people of a poorer background, and PISA doesn't really take that into account. It's just a test score. So some of those criticisms are valid, but you should actually take the time, if you're interested in this anyway, to go to the website of those PISA measurements, because they have a huge methodology section. And for example, something they routinely do in their tests, if they see that one particular test item, one particular question that they asked of all the students in all of these different countries, if they notice that one country does particularly well and the other countries do particularly poorly, they'll investigate and they'll look at, is this really a fair comparison, or are we biasing things in favor of one country? And so they routinely do those kinds of tests to make sure that the comparisons that they make are fair. And I guess this is sort of the theme of this talk, right? There's good measurement and there's bad measurement. And I think something I see a lot in journalism is people having sort of either being too trusting of numbers in general and just saying like, oh yeah, GDP went up by 0.5% and that's just what it is, without sort of thinking about what that number means critically. And then there's another set of people who tend to just sort of not trust any numbers at all and just say like, well, there's these PISA comparisons of math scores, but what, it's just a number. And really it's interesting to look very specifically at what are the particular problems that any particular kind of measurement has. And so, for numbers that are important in government and numbers that we use to measure societies, some of the questions you could be asking are, are we sticking to an old and imperfect metric for the sake of comparability? That often leads old metrics to sort of stay in place when really they should disappear. Is the metric just the first thing that came to mind? You would be surprised, like another university ranking is the Shanghai ranking, and they decide whether your university is better or worse than another university, in part based on how many Nobel Prize winners you have. So like, I went to the University of Ghent, which would definitely not be in the top 100, I'm sorry to say, but now it is because we had a couple of Nobel Prize winners. And so it feels like the first number that came to mind. Like, how will we judge the quality of a university? I don't know, Nobel Prize winners maybe? So, that's a good question to ask, because a lot of numbers are total crap, really. Does the metric compare apples to apples? So that's a question, for example, you could ask of the PISA scores. Is Finland really comparable to the US or to any other country? All right, let's switch to a slightly different topic. So the right answer to the wrong question. This is usually a problem in science. And there are sort of two main cases I want to discuss. One is IQ and heritability, which a lot of people are very confused about. And then I'll have some other examples as well. Perhaps the best way to illustrate it is by looking at sort of a common psychological piece of research. For example, a psychologist might study what happens to people when every day they solve a Sudoku. This is like, if you look in Google Scholar, so that's scholar.google.com, and you look for Sudoku, you will find thousands of pieces of research. So I'm not just pulling this out of my behind. And for example, one research setup might be, you have one group of people who solve a Sudoku every day for a month, another group of people who just read the newspaper every day, every month. And you follow those people over time, and then you look at who comes out, that might be the research question, who is more intelligent at the end of that month. And so that might be a PR message, like it turns out that solving Sudokus improves your brain. That's the kind of PR message that we're all familiar with, right? If you then look at the actual research, that's not at all what the research will say. Often what the research will be like is they will do a certain test. They will, for example, present 7 or 8 or 10 words to the participants of the test, and they will ask you like, all right, try to remember these random words or try to remember these random characters. And then depending on how many of those characters or of how many of those words you remember, they will say, well, that has a bearing on your working memory, right? If you can remember more of them, your working memory is better. And then they will make the further step and they will say, well, if your working memory is better, there is some evidence that actually, evidence that is actually there, that if your working memory is better, you will in general sort of behave more intelligently in certain types of situations. But still, if you look at what actually happened is there's research that had people solve a Sudoku for a month and then remember random characters. That is what actually happened. That is the statistical research that happened, the experimental setup. And if you then look at the PR message that the university put out, what they actually put out is that solving Sudokus makes you more intelligent, which is totally different. And those kinds of sort of sleights of hand happen a lot in science, where the question that researchers think they are answering is actually not at all the question they are answering. And so we have to be sort of very careful of that. IQ and heritability is a really interesting one in that regard too, for a couple of reasons. One is that psychologists have decided that IQ means intelligence, but have you ever looked at an IQ test? Maybe some of you have taken an IQ test. One common question might be, they show you a bunch of triangles that are interlocked. And so by being interlocked, they create even more triangles. And then they will ask you, like, count how many triangles there are in total. There are some reasons to suppose that, if you can accurately count all of those little triangles, that may mean that you're more intelligent. But on the other hand, I think sort of the common sense idea that we have of, is a person intelligent or is he not intelligent? You wouldn't ask them to sort of count triangles, right? And so the idea of IQ and the idea of intelligence are already two different things. Scientists do try to be careful of that kind of of those kinds of definitions, which are operational definitions, as they call them. But there's still always the question of, do they really measure what they think they measure? This gets really tricky once you get into heritability, and so some of you in the room might probably be familiar with the book The Bell Curve. It probably depends on when you were born. Essentially what it says was that even after subtracting all of the sort of environmental influences, like your background, even then essentially people from different races had a different innate intelligence or whatever. That was sort of the thesis of the book. But what does that really mean? So what they said was that there's a certain amount of intelligence that is that you inherit from your parents instead of being from society. And then the second factor, which is that this supposedly depends on race. But what does heritability really mean? Well, for starters, if you look at how statistics work, statistics always compares averages between people. And so it might say, like, the people on the left side of the room have 2 additional IQ points over the right side of the room, or vice versa, of course. But that's on average. It doesn't say anything about any of you in particular. That's just an average. So that's the first thing to take into account. Statistics always talks about averages. And then the second thing is that something that sort of follows is if you look at the variability in IQs, it goes from anywhere up to, I think 60 is probably about the lowest you can get, to over 200. And so if people in one group have an IQ between 50 and 200, and in the other group between 50 and 201, and because of that, the average in the other group is a little bit higher, well, do we really care about the fact that there's a 1-point difference in average or a 5-point difference in the two averages between the two groups when the variability within each group is so much larger? Another way to illustrate this, which I think I have on here, is the perennial question that people get asked, like, are boys better at math than girls? And even, like, regardless of the research, and there's research pointing in many different directions on this, and I think most people believe, most scientists believe that there's really not much of a difference at all or no difference. But even regardless of that, let's assume for the moment, for the sake of argument, that boys on average would perform on a random math test, would get an average of 65%, and girls would get an average of 62%. All right, good. But the variability within those two groups, girls might have a score everywhere up from 0 to 100, and boys might have a score everywhere up from 0 to 100. And so the individual variability between the groups is really not that important. Yet it's sort of what keeps being reiterated in, when these kinds of comparisons between groups of any kind, not just intelligence, not just math abilities, but any kind of comparisons between groups, they always tend to overemphasize the group differences and not the differences within the groups. And so they answer, to a large extent, I think, the wrong question. We covered this. So some questions you might ask when you're looking at scientific studies and you want to know, like, are they really saying what they think they're saying, is how many steps are there between the statistics and the actual conclusion? In science, among statistics, this is often known as story time, because you have like a very niche statistical conclusion about this group who did this very specific procedure is a little bit different in this way than this other group. And then scientists will draw this entire story around it, a story that has nothing to do with the statistics whatsoever, but is sort of vaguely supported by it. So that's always a good question to ask. Are there other ways to interpret the data? Better or worse or more or less are meaningless comparisons by how much. So for example, if you read research and it says, you know, boys are better at girls than math, the first question you should ask is like, okay, by how much? And does that quantity really matter? Between group versus within group. We didn't really talk about whether something is representative or cherry-picked. I think a good example of that would be that every beer in the world is probably the best beer in the world. Why? There are thousands and thousands of beer competitions in the world, and if you don't get a gold medal for one of those 1,000, then your beer has to be really, really bad, because almost anyone can get a gold medal. Just by the sheer fact of the fact that there are so many competitions. So beware of cherry-picked numbers, of course. The third thing I wanted to talk about is, juking the stats. What happens when we measure performance? First, I'm going to get some water, though. This is probably something that most of you have good examples of how when you measure something and when you judge people's performance and their job might depend on it, people are very creative at gaming the system, at juking the stats, at finding ways to attain those performance targets, but probably not in the way that you intended. Police ticketing quota. When police sometimes institutes quota for ticketing, what they really want is for police officers to do more work, to work faster, to sort of go more deeply. What ends up happening is, officers just end up ticketing everyone who does anything that is even slightly sort of south of the law. So most police forces have stopped doing this because the quota just lead to lots of stupid arrests. You drive 2 kilometers an hour too fast, and that's a speed ticket. Those kinds of things. Plea bargaining, I think mostly an issue in the U.S. where they try to avoid things going to trial, and so public prosecutors and lawyers are being incentivized to not let things go to trial, but instead to have people bargain for a plea. The problem that this has given rise to in the US especially is that what ends up happening is the public prosecutor will make the defendant so scared of going to trial, like even if they're innocent, they say like, all right, we believe you, you're innocent, but you know, maybe the judge won't believe you and you might end up going to jail for 40, 50 years just because they absolutely don't want to have things go to trial. And so by measuring the performance of a public prosecutor by how many plea bargains they are able to strike, a lot of people in the US, yeah, and I think it's actually fair to say a lot of people, even though I can't really quantify that, a lot of people are going to jail even though they're innocent because they are sort of almost threatened into striking a plea bargain. Teaching to the test, I would say, you know, again, something of a US problem, but certainly a European problem as well. If you judge teachers by how well their students do on a given test, what will the teacher do? Improve their teaching or just change their teaching so it aligns perfectly with the test? Well, you know, they will likely do the latter. Research has shown that companies that chase quarterly profit targets usually have lower R&D investments, and that in the long term they will actually do worse because they focus so much on the short term. Something you've seen in the food industry, for example, is at a certain point people said, you know, all of this very fatty food, we need to get rid of it, and the food industry said, all right, we can get rid of it, and in turn they dropped the fat and they added more sugars because we didn't say that they couldn't add more sugars. And so, you know, that's another example of sort of how the wrong incentives are created. Page views and clickbait, you know, is an obvious one for this audience, I suppose. And so I think a lot of people probably think that performance measurement in general is something that should be gotten rid of because there's just too much that can go wrong. But there's great examples of performance measurement as well where it's really improved society. We've already talked about in Massachusetts how the measurement of the cardiac surgeries, how it's led to vastly fewer complications in surgeries. And so, you know, you might think like, I don't know if I really want my doctor to have a report card, but you know, if you have to have a heart surgery, then I think you'd be inclined to look at it anyway, right? And I want to go in depth on that specific example because they really did it right in Massachusetts. This was a team of, not MIT, of Harvard statisticians who created the performance measurement for heart surgeons. They did a lot of stuff right. One is that they focused on the process more than on the outcome. So stuff like, really stuff like, did you wash your hands? Did you administer antibiotics before the operation? So actually something that in the past didn't used to happen all the time is that there's so many things that can go wrong during surgery. And one easy fix is to just, it sounds stupid, but it really works, to administer antibiotics before every major surgery. A lot of doctors didn't used to do it, and their patients suffered for it. So one of the things they measure in Massachusetts is, you know, did you administer antibiotics at least 1 hour before the surgery? The nice thing about process metrics like that, and so of course there's many other process metrics that they look at, but that I don't understand because, you know, I didn't study medicine. The nice thing about it is you can actually achieve them, and a lot of doctors went from a scorecard where they had a global score of 70% to a global score of 100%. Unlike a performance target, you know, it's actually possible with a process metric. If you just do everything that is on the checklist, you will make it, and you will get the best possible numbers. It's very difficult to game those numbers as well because you have to do something and either you did it or you didn't do it. It's very hard to game. Another thing they did right is that, you know, you might be wondering, are we comparing apples to apples? And so a problem is that the counterintuitive thing that you see when you do performance measurement is that if you have unadjusted numbers, the best surgeons are actually going to get the worst scores. And why is that? So the reason that happens is because if someone has a really, really difficult surgery, that's going to be a surgery that you only want the very best doctor for, right? And so it's the very best doctors who will accept the most difficult surgeries. But those have the highest probability of failing because they're just so difficult. And so the result is that often the very best doctors get the worst stats because they get the hard cases. And doctors that are maybe not very good only accept the easy cases, and so their stats are awesome. And everyone thinks they're great doctors. The team at Harvard realized this very early on, and so they correct all of the scores for the difficulty of the cases that are being taken on. Various other innovations were sort of included that, I don't think we need to really go into, but it's worth looking up if you're interested in this sort of thing. All of their work is sort of public on how they created all of those measurements, etc. And so you can just look up all of the reports. It's really fascinating. So questions you could ask is like, if there was a performance measurement, the question might be, is this the only thing that matters? If we do more of this, will we do less of that? It's always a question with perverse incentives, right? Like, if you say, like, well, we need to get more page views, then that probably means you're going to do less investigative journalism. You have more of the one, but less of the other. And that's often not taken into account. Another question, are there not so honorable ways to reach the target? Can the system be gamed? Are people rewarded for actions or for outcomes? Actions are usually harder to game. Are we asking people to work harder or smarter? Because usually what you see with performance measurement is just asking people to sort of work harder and harder and harder, but the quality of the work suffers. And so those were sort of the main things I wanted to go through, sort of the problems with metrics in government, the problems with metrics in science, and the problems with metrics in business. And I think when we think about this stuff, I think a lot of us get sort of, discouraged about it, because if you look at all of the problems that exist with measurements, it has led to sort of many unfortunate situations, like in the ways that teachers and doctors are being judged that are not always fair. And so sometimes we would think, like, maybe it's better to just get rid of all of it. But I think you have to take into account how far we have come in certain ways. Like, it was only only 100 years ago when even the quantification of science was not that far along, and where, for example, if Freud had a certain theory about how you were feeling right now was related to your mother, then he could just sort of spout that sort of innocence, where nowadays in psychological science, if you don't have the stats to back up what you do, then you're not going to get anywhere. Sort of the same thing with certain issues anyway, where in government, it used to be possible to just sort of spout any kind of nonsense about how you were going to fix the economy. Now people are slowly starting to demand some evidence and starting to demand some actual numbers, which I think has sort of really improved society as a whole. And so I don't think it's possible to really say, like, numbers have been bad to society, but it's also certainly not the case where you can say, like, well, numbers have been and quantification, the quantification of society has been a boon to society, because it certainly has not always been that way. And so I think the solution is just really to ask all of those difficult questions, not say, like, a metric is good, a metric is bad, but see if it survives sort of some of the questions that I've outlined. And hopefully that way, sort of slowly but surely, it will be the kind of thing that we become as a society better at. And I think that is my talk. So thanks. So are there any questions? Yes. Do we work with a mic, or? Oh, let's wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much for the talk. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Now, I work for the Open Knowledge Foundation Germany, and we work a lot with open data and government data. And sometimes I feel that the government data we work with is kind of the slush that comes out of the administrative processes.
Right.
And then I wonder what the data that we work with, is that a proxy to what we actually want to know? And how do you have suggestions how to change this? And how to kind of get new data to actually measure what we want to know instead of what is just given to us.
So it definitely depends on the data. I guess one way of thinking about some of the sort of examples from business I gave was it's often sort of put under the moniker of Goodhart's law. Is like when people know you're measuring something in a certain way, it stops becoming a good measure because people will sort of hack it. And so I don't know if that's the case for the data that you have, because that could create problems. On the other hand, you mentioned that a lot of that data is administrative data and it's proxy data. But actually, I think proxy data can be perfectly fine. One example, for example, that we didn't go into, but for example, is BMI. And so the way we measure our weight and whether it's normal. And so BMI is a proxy for a true measure of health, right? It's not, it has many problems. So for example, it doesn't work for athletic people. It doesn't work for people who are what are called skinny fat, But in general, so it's kind of a lousy measure. But on the other hand, it's better than nothing, and you sometimes have to compare the information not to the ideal information that would be available, but you have to compare the information to what did you have otherwise. Some people call this sort of entropy reduction. To what extent can you reduce the uncertainty with the data that you have? Of course, this totally not answer your specific question, but that's perhaps sort of more interesting for after the talk. I'd be happy to sort of talk through that. Any other questions?
Hello, hi.
Hey.
Pardon my English, it is not very good.
That's fine.
I know it's not the topic of what you talked about, but I am very interested in the use of the statistics in sports because I am a sports journalist. In the US, there is a large use of statistics to, measure performances and stuff like that.
Right.
And there is an increasing use of statistics even in football here in Europe. And so I wanted to ask you if you think that the metric used in the sports statistics are still good, or we have to change that, and if for a sport like football, they are we can use also on a sport like football that is not so full of statistics like baseball or American football and stuff like that. Thank you.
Oh, I think the reason why those things keep advancing is because there's money involved, right? And so if the question is, are those statistics any good? Well, if they weren't, people wouldn't be using them because it's sort of like their livelihood of those trainers, et cetera, depends on it. It's an interesting question, though. Like, I've often wondered about this in the context of football, where, and I'm not really a huge soccer fan, but if you looked at some of the old games from like the 70s and the 80s, there were sort of many players doing lots of flourishes and sort of interesting stuff. But nowadays, it feels like everyone is playing like sort of really in a really focused way, and I think in many ways that's because of the statistics, because it's shown that you can do all of these impressive things, but it doesn't contribute to your probability of actually winning the game. And I think so what I'm mostly interested in is how perhaps the designers of the game, because sometimes the rules change, not often, but sometimes the rules change, how the designers of the game might respond to those statistics by changing the game to make it more interesting again. I heard an example of baseball, and I know absolutely nothing about baseball, but where I think how it was described to me was that sort of every 10 years or so, they might decide to make the pitch where catcher is doing his thing, make it a little bit higher or a little bit lower because it makes the game more or less offensive. And so they actually change the game if they feel like, you know, the stats people have made it too boring. And yeah, that's something I'm really curious about. Whether as a journalist we are more likely to see more stats in sort of reporting of soccer, etc. I have no idea. Thanks.
Do you think that journalists in general are becoming more aware of all the biases and all the problems with metrics in general? Are they doing a better work? I'm considering the fact that there are a lot of data journalists working in the newsroom right now, so does it have, from your point of view, a significant impact on the quality of the work we produce?
Yes, to a certain extent, but I'm actually kind of pessimistic on that front because I feel like, and this is actually tomorrow's talk that I'll be doing in the same place, same time, about correlation and causation. So what I hear a lot is actually journalists just saying, and data journalists just saying, like, we found a pattern here, and you know, it may be biased, and it may be only a correlation, and there's no cause, but oh well, that's the best we can do. And so that really disappoints me because there's a lot of sophistication in the visualization of the data, but not necessarily in sort of the statistical reasoning behind it. But that's just my opinion, I guess.
First of all, thank you for your speech.
Thanks.
It's really clear and direct. And my question is about, probably it's inside of the boundaries of your speech. It's about finance. It's because, you know, since probably 2006, 2008, also the financial institutions are demanding new metrics for measuring social impact. So that how we can measure intangible assets, because for example, they are launching, for example, in UK and in US, the so-called social impact bond. Basically, they don't want guarantees, probably from social enterprises and from the community, but they want to be more or less sure about the potential, you know, impact they have on the territories, on their communities. So that, according to your experiences, there are some banks or institutions or foundations that are making this kind of practice, you know, inside their organization, according to your experience.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes it works. So for example, if you follow the stock market, it's possible to buy index funds that do not include companies that are related to producing arms or that are not related to sort of mining in conflict areas and that kind of thing. I don't know. It's, you know, especially if you look at sort of ecological initiatives, there's a lot of greenwashing going on, of course, with a lot of companies saying that they've become more ecological or that they've become more socially responsible. But is that really true? On the other hand, it's like if a company like Apple, for example, if they put out numbers about the actual ecological impact that they're having and those numbers are audited, that's certainly better than what happened like 10 years ago when they weren't putting out any numbers at all and they could just say anything they wished. So it's sort of like the old saying that it's easy to lie with statistics, but it's even easier to lie without statistics. So yeah, I'm very skeptical of all of those measurements, but I'd be even more skeptical of companies not doing any of those initiatives. I guess that's sort of my short answer. No more questions? All right, well, thanks everybody.